What if Arnold Schwarzenegger played Dr. Manhattan, or Tom Cruise played Ozymandias? Not only that, what if the film was directed by Bourne Ultimatum director Paul Greengrass in his signature shaky cam documentary style, and it took place in the present day? And what if the ending featured time travel, erasing the Watchmen from existence, only for them to end up as the stars of their own comic book? Believe it or not, all of these things almost happened. So to find out how we went from all of that to the movie we got, let's dive in and take a look at what could have been Watchmen. The first attempt to adapt Watchmen into a feature film occurred when the comic series came out in the mid-80s, as Predator and Die Hard producers Joel Silver and Lawrence Gordon acquired the film rights. And while they'd approached the comic's writer, Alan Moore, to write the screenplay, he declined. As a result, the producers returned to future Batman '89 writer Sam Hamm. However, Hamm struggled to condense the sprawling 338-page comic into the industry-standard 120-page script, leading him to make several changes and deletions. The film would have opened in the mid-70s, with the Watchmen intervening to subdue a terrorist attack on the Statue of Liberty, much to the chagrin of the police. But when Dr. Manhattan fails to stop the lead terrorist from destroying Lady Liberty, it sparks a massive backlash, with the media and an outraged public turning against the team. In the aftermath, the president signs the Keene Act into law, outlawing vigilantism altogether, as the Watchmen are ultimately forced to disband. The film would have then jumped ahead 10 years, with Walter Kovacs hearing that the comedian had been murdered, which the script doesn't show. In fact, the comedian wouldn't have appeared in this version of the film at all, which means the movie cuts everything tied to his past. Hardly any Minutemen, no attempted assault by comedian on Sally Jupiter, and no subplot involving Laurie's hidden paternity and her feud with her mother. And unlike the comic and final film, Rorschach's journal isn't used as the film's narrative backbone either. Ozymandias' plan in the third act is also radically different. Instead of staging a catastrophic event to unite the world, this version has him building a tachyon chamber to rewrite history itself. His logic is simple and terrifying. The moment John Osterman became Dr. Manhattan, the entire world snapped into a new, unstable track. Manhattan's existence is what escalated America's power, what warped the Cold War, and what pushed humanity toward inevitable nuclear annihilation. So Ozymandias decides the only real solution is to travel back to 1962 and assassinate John before the accident ever happens, erasing Dr. Manhattan from the timeline entirely. But the plan collapses. As Ozymandias attempts to jump, he's vaporized by the machine. And in a final twist, Dr. Manhattan, having regained his sense of humanity, chooses to sacrifice himself by going back in time to save his former self, preventing the transformation and giving John Osterman a chance at a normal, happy life with Janie Slater. The timeline resets, America no longer wins Vietnam, Nixon resigns after Watergate, and nuclear war with Russia is avoided. When the remaining Watchmen suddenly reappear in New York City, they're the only ones who still remember the original timeline, as they stumble across a Watchmen comic on a newsstand. The reason Hamm changed the third act was because he realized the story of a fake alien menace being used to scare the world into peace was stolen from an old Outer Limits episode called The Architects of Fear. In fact, Moore even included a reference to this episode in the comic. Sam Hamm, remembering the episode, advised the producers that they'd get sued into oblivion if they used it in the movie, since Moore explicitly referenced the episode in the comics, forcing Hamm to have to figure out a different third act. Terry Gilliam, director of Brazil and who would go on to direct 12 Monkeys and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, was hired to helm the movie. As for casting, Silver wanted Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Manhattan, having just worked with him on Predator. Both David Bowie and Robin Williams wanted to play Rorschach, while Richard Gere wanted to play Night Owl. Jamie Lee Curtis was also rumored for Silk Spectre. Unhappy with Hamm's adaptation of the script, Gilliam restored Rorschach's journal as a voiceover, as well as other scenes from the comic book that Hamm had removed. However, he still felt there wasn't enough time in a 2-hour movie to tell their stories, and was dismayed that the comedian had been reduced to someone who dies off-screen at the beginning of the film to kick off the action. Unhappy with the results, he suggested it might work better as a 5-part miniseries instead. Not only that, because CGI was still in its infancy, most, if not all, of the visual effects would have had to be pulled off practically, including Schwarzenegger as Dr. Manhattan. And with Terry Gilliam's track record for bonkers and inventive practical effects in films like Brazil and Time Bandits, this version would have leaned hard into that handcrafted spectacle instead of the digital polish of Snyder's film. However, the script was referred to in Hollywood as the $1 million a page script, since it would have been so incredibly expensive to do with the limitations of the era, even with Gilliam's ingenuity. Ultimately, because both Gilliam and Silver were coming off expensive productions versions that went way over budget, Gilliam with The Adventures of Baron Munchausen and Silver with Die Hard 2, studios weren't eager to take on another financial gamble. As a result, Silver could only secure around $25 million for the film, barely a quarter of what the project actually needed, as it would fall apart. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and David Hayter, writer of X-Men 1 and 2, plus the voice of Solid Snake, would take another stab at writing the script. To prove that he could direct it himself, Hayter created a proof-of-concept test featuring Rorschach and Night Owl. To play Rorschach, Hayter got his friend Daniel Craig, but he dropped out the day before, saying he wasn't feeling it. The shoot would be postponed a week as Punisher Warzone's Ray Stevenson would step into the role, while Game of Thrones' Ian Glenn would play Night Owl. Studios, though, were ultimately hesitant to hand a high-budget, complex adaptation to a first-time director, as Hayter would remain the film's writer. And as the film's writer, Hayter was uneasy about adapting the comic's original ending so soon after 9/11, and also felt that if you included the giant squid, explaining its origins would have taken another 30 minutes of screen time, which the movie didn't have room for. At one point, Hayter considered replacing it with a devastating sun laser strike, but he eventually came to realize that idea was horrible. The solution would come from Darren Aronofsky, who at one point was hired to direct, although he literally only lasts 1 week on the film. A physicist friend of Aronofsky's suggested making Dr. Manhattan the perceived threat instead of an alien invasion, who the world unites against. That idea stuck, and it ultimately became the ending Zack Snyder used in his final film. However, in Hayter's original version, Ozymandias would have created a fake projection of Dr. Manhattan that attacked several cities, before Night Owl would have killed him by crushing him with a ship. Aronofsky would be forced to drop out of the film in order to finish The Fountain, as Paul Greengrass, director of the Bourne Identity sequels and known for his faux documentary style, would replace him, and his version of the film would come very close to being made. Not only that, it would have been very different to Snyder's. First of all, Greengrass's version would have been shot in a signature gritty, grounded cinema verite style, shot like a tense, real-world documentary, rather than Snyder's hyper-stylized approach built around slow motion. In other words, raw, handheld realism versus sleek, heightened spectacle. Greengrass wanted the Watchmen to feel like real people in the real world, and to frame their superhero identities as outright delusions. Broken, dangerous individuals dressing up in costumes, convincing themselves they're heroes, when in reality they're just violent vigilantes looking for purpose, later saying that Todd Phillips' Joker did something very similar to what he wanted to do. Greengrass's film also would have opened with Eddie Blake framed like a Superman-style hero, handsome, hair flowing, flying through the air, until the cameras pull back and you realize the truth. He isn't flying at all. He's plummeting off a building to his death, instantly subverting the audience's expectations from the very first image. Greengrass also wanted to set the film in the present day, fearing that a full-on period setting would muddy the identity of the story, making it harder for audiences to tell what was authentically 80s and what was uniquely Watchmen's strange alternate history. As a result, the comedian would have fought in the First and Second Gulf Wars, while the conflict with Russia would have been changed to one with Afghanistan, with a communist being replaced with Middle Eastern terrorists. As for Rorschach, initial concept drawings had him wearing his iconic mask, but with a bulging coat, eschewing the film noir look of the character. However, after Greengrass came across a picture of a homeless man whose face was so caked in dirt that it was like a mask, Greengrass decided to do the same with Rorschach when he takes off his mask, so it's like he never really takes it off. Dr. Manhattan's look was also explored with the character having visible intestines. In respect to the cast, English actor Paddy Considine was lined up to play Rorschach, while both Jude Law and Tom Cruise actively lobbied for the role of Ozymandias. Greengrass also had Joaquin Phoenix in mind for Night Owl, Hilary Swank as Silk Spectre, and Ron Perlman was rumored for the comedian. So what went wrong? Even though Watchmen was set up at Paramount, the executive who had been championing the project ended up leaving the studio, and once they were gone, their replacement came in with a different priority: cut costs, minimize risks, and avoid anything that didn't look like a guaranteed hit or franchise. When they looked at Watchmen, a bleak, R-rated deconstruction of superheroes with zero obvious sequel potential, they didn't see a tentpole, they saw liability. Greengrass needed roughly $100 million to pull it off, and the numbers only got uglier because the film was set to shoot in London at Pinewood Studios. At the time, the US dollar was historically weak against the British pound, which effectively inflated the budget, making the production around 20 to 30% more expensive before a single frame was shot. Paramount pushed Greengrass to scale it back to keep the film alive, but he refused to dilute the vision, and that standoff is what ultimately froze the movie in its tracks. But the project didn't stay dead for long. Warner Brothers swooped in, agreed to co-produce, and ultimately became the studio that finally pushed Watchmen over the finish line. Zack Snyder, coming off his breakout success with 300, a stylized adaptation of Frank Miller's comic, to Warner Brothers looked like the perfect director for the job. Snyder kept what he considered the best elements from Hayter's drafts, while steering the story back into its original Cold War setting. And while Snyder's adaptation remains divisive to this day, the road to getting there proved to be just as chaotic, complex, and morally ambiguous as the Watchmen themselves. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.